So I will make this quick, and I come at this a little bit from a little bit different angle, I think, than a lot of people that have presented so far, because I am a professor of sport commerce and entertainment management, but so I teach like marketing and sport and entertainment, but what I research is group behavior, and really the whatever causes one individual to treat another individual differently based purely on their group preferences or whatever groups they identify with. So that could be sport teams, that could be political ideologies, that could be where they grew up, anything that would cause somebody to treat someone differently. And so over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, we have built a pretty sizable comparison between different consumer settings and group settings. And so this is another one that we did, where all of these smaller projects and comparisons compare how group behavior manifests and how people react and behave toward group members in the sports setting with another non-sport setting. And so in this one, as you can see, this is sport teams and with people who consider themselves fans of theme parks. I'm trying to, oh, you have to do it on there. Okay. So as far as an introduction, a lot of what we know about competition and rivalry comes from social identity theory. And I think most people know that really dictates how we categorize ourselves, how we categorize other people, but it also tells us what groups we are going to join. So if we see ourselves as hardworking or as honest, we want to join groups that we feel exhibit those behaviors. And also, we want our groups to exhibit those behaviors, so we tend to highlight those attributes of the group. And we'll highlight the positive attributes of our group and the negative attributes of a rival group or an out group. Then when we look specifically at competition and rivalry, it influences the way we look at in-group members and out-group members. It influences the way that we describe actions by in-group and out-group members. If you've linguistic intergroup bias, we will stereotype positive behaviors to our in-group, and we will stereotype negative behaviors to the out-group, which is kind of interesting because the out-group is doing the exact same thing toward whatever group we consider ourselves to be in. And so it influences our likely behaviors toward each other, whether people will try to help someone in emergency situations, oftentimes, or can be impacted by whatever group they are a member of. We see that, unfortunately, time and time again. Situational assessments that people make. So if someone makes a mistake or does something that they get in trouble for, some type of indiscretion, if it is a in-group member, that tends to, or if it's an out-group member, people tend to evaluate that as more heinous or more negative than if it's an in-group member. And then also with the marketing and product promotion that we have several times where in our consumer culture, we highlight the differences between our in-group and an out-group and why our in-group is better. And so rivalry really comes from competitors evaluating each other and perceived importance and treating each other as a threat. And that's usually vicariously. So that means vicarious through someone else, not direct face-to-face competitor or direct face-to-face threat with somebody. Now, rivalry and group behavior can be influenced because on the positive side, if you're looking at this from a consumer perspective or a production perspective, it can increase consumption of a product. but it can also increase derogation or negativity toward somebody. It can increase a person's likelihood to celebrate failure by an out group. If we look at Schadenfreude and taking pleasure from the demise of someone else, or also if we look at something that I have coined glory out of reflective failure, where you take joy from your out group failing in an indirect competition. So something that you have nothing to do with, but you take joy in that because somehow that makes you feel better and that reflects more positively on your in group. And then sadly, it can also influence a person's likelihood to consider anonymous aggression toward others. Now, this comes from the sports setting where myself and Dan Wann and some others have done some work where we have repeatedly we've asked people their likelihood to consider anonymous aggression toward out-group members. And consistently over 6 different samples, we have seen that there's a small percentage, but there is a consistent percentage of people that would definitely be willing to consider the most heinous acts of aggression toward out-group members, just based on the fact that that person is a member of an out-group, not a member of their in-group. And so here, as I mentioned, we have compared group behavior and rivalry and the way people view group members in different settings. And so here's what we have. We start with sport because that's where I started my research over a decade ago, but we've compared with politics, and we've compared with online gaming, both using a PC or the internet or a console, and using a console like Xbox and PlayStation. We've looked at direct to consumer streaming services, Samsung and Apple mobile phones, and science fiction, the fandoms of entertainment brands like Star Wars and Star Trek, and brands of fans of Marvel and DC, and even Disney fans' perceptions toward Universal parks. And so this really looks at a broader look at that theme park fandom, not just looking at Disney fans. And so here were the 3 hypotheses that we started out with: that sport fandom, there would be differences between people who consider themselves fans of sport and people who consider themselves fans of a theme park. There would be differences in the way that they view their favorite brand, but also the way that they view their rival brand. Then hypothesis 2 and 3 really look at the common in-group, where if a person identifies as a fan of both being a sport, or both a sport team and a theme park fan, then they will have significant differences from someone who considers themselves to be only a fan of sport. And we did the same thing for theme parks. So someone who is only a fan of theme parks versus someone who considers themselves a fan of a sport team and theme parks. And so what we found was, out of the responses that we had, and I had mentioned in the abstract, this was something we had presented on earlier, but we had some data that we had to remove. And so it's a smaller sample size than originally used in our original analysis. So we had to reanalyze things. And here's the gender breakdown and also our age demographic. The mean was 35, almost 36 years, with a standard deviation of about almost 11 years, almost 12 years. And so to further the demographics of the participants, when asked if someone considered themselves a fan of either a sport team, theme parks, or both sport team and theme parks, 29.8% said they were fans of theme parks, 37.2% were fans of a sport team only, and then 33% reported being a fan of both a sport team and theme parks. Now, if you look at theme park fandom, most of the results come from or most of these parks are located within the United States. This was an online survey, so anyone around the world could have completed this, but based on this, it looks like most of the respondents came from within the United States, because if you look at the favorite theme park, Disney, and that there's not a distinction between Disneyland or Walt Disney World in the United States, or I'm sorry, for the purposes of this study. But the favorite brands were Disney, Six Flags, and Universal. And likewise, the rivals, who people considered the rival brand for theme parks, were Disney, Universal, and Six Flags, with also Dollywood in there. And if you're local to this area, then people probably have heard of Dollywood at some point. The theme park run by, and the entertainment run by the musician Dolly Parton. And so for our method, what we looked at is we looked at identification and favorite attitudes toward our favorite brands. And then we looked at how we perceive the rival brand and members of that out group. So to measure identification, we use something called the Spectator Identification Scale Revised. That was the first scale developed to measure sport fandom. And a person's attachment and level of identification with the sport team. When we started doing these comparisons with sport and non-sport settings, the SSIS revised really held up well. So we've kept using that. To measure our favorite attitudes, or attitudes toward our favorite brands, we used the 5-item semantic differential scale to measure attitude toward brands. And then to look at the rival perceptions, the way a person perceives the out group, in addition to the 5-point semantic differential scale, we included the rivalry perception scale and the glory out of reflective failure scales. Those are scales that I and my colleagues have developed. The rivalry perception scale really looks at 4 different facets of out group perceptions. How likely would someone be to support the out group in some type of competition or indirect competition? And also how excited or how much satisfaction do they receive when their in group has compared favorably to the out group in a direct fashion. So if you're talking about a sport team, that's when 2 teams are playing each other, who wins, who feels better. But if you're talking about something non-sport, like in this, the theme park setting, it would be a fan of, maybe let's say a fan of the Disney parks, which is kind of a somewhat awkward topic right now, but fan of the Disney parks, like taking joy because they receive better news of an opening attraction than does Universal Parks, something like that. The RPS also measures the way in-group members look at or view the behavior of out-group members. So the way that they behave toward other people, do they consider themselves good fans, or do they consider themselves to have negative behavior or attitudes towards someone else? And then finally, it also measures the prestige of that out group. Glory out of reflective failure measures what I had talked about before, the likelihood to celebrate when someone experiences indirect failure. And then the group behavior composite, or the GBC, is really something that I developed this last year in looking at all of these comparisons, where the group behavior composite is made up of the 4 subscales of the RPS and also the glory out of reflective failure scale. And the group behavior composite, what it is able to do is it provides one score for a participant to show which setting influences more negative behavior toward a rival group or an out group in these different consumer settings. And so here's the reliability. All of the scales, as they have throughout all of these comparisons, have shown strong reliability. And so for hypothesis 1, when we compared people who were fans of only sport versus people who were fans of only theme parks, there were significant differences, and I think most people this probably makes a lot of sense to people. Sport fans reported higher identification with their favorite brand. They reported higher or more positive attitudes toward their favorite brand. And then they reported more negativity toward the rival brand than did theme park fans. So they reported more negative attitudes toward the rival team, more negative. They believed rival sport fans behaved more poorly. They were more likely to experience glory out of reflective failure, and they scored higher on the group behavior composite. So that basically means that while fans reported higher identification and attitudes toward their favorite brands, they were more negative toward the rival or out group than were fans of theme parks, which I think is something that probably most people could imagine. And we'll get to the GBC in a little bit to look more at that. So hypothesis 2 looked at people who consider themselves to be a fan of only theme parks versus those people who were a fan of both theme parks and a sport team. And with that, there were significant differences in the attitudes people reported toward their favorite brand. So someone who was a fan of both theme parks and a sport team reported more or higher, more favorable attitudes toward their favorite theme park brand than someone who was reported to be only a fan of theme parks. Now, when we tried to look at the sports side, there were no significant differences. So what this tells us is the influence of sport fandom is greater than the influence of theme park fandom when you're looking at these types of comparisons, because hypothesis 2 was significant. Hypothesis 2 was partially supported, while hypothesis 3 was not supported. Now, looking at the GBC, the Group Behavior Composite, one really cool thing that we did last year is we were able to develop and identify the hierarchy of out-group derogation. And so this is really the takeaway of this, and the next spectrum that we're going to look at are the takeaways from all of these projects. And this is the comparison or the list of which group settings cause the most negativity. So as you can see, it goes from highly negative down to low negativity. So highly negative, the settings of online gaming. So people who either participate using a console versus people who participate using like the internet, was actually the most negative, interestingly, higher than politics or sport. And then as you go down, what we'll see is theme parks, which was the current study, is number 6 on this list, in what we have looked at as medium negative, above gaming consoles, Disney park fandom, science fiction, and comics. And so this next spectrum will kind of add a little bit more to that, because this includes the mean scores for all of these figures. Now, first, I want to point out that you can see this is a 7-point, the GBC is on a 7-point scale. And so 1 being least negative, 7 being the most negative. And so if we're looking at the neutral point of 4, there are 2 settings that are below the neutral point of 4, which would be, you could surmise to say, people that are comics fans or science fiction fans actually have positive views of whatever rival brand they're looking at. So a comics fan who's a Marvel fan might have a positive view of a DC fan or the DC brand. Same thing if you're a fan of Star Trek, you might have a positive view of the Star Wars franchise, which both of those groups have been groups that kind of have to, they have common interest. And if you're a fan of comics, you're probably a fan of both of those major groups on some level, or brands on some level. But also fans of comics and fans of science fiction, I think, have tended to maybe have to stick together because of the way people talk to those fans and the way they view those fans, especially as people get older and they retain those fandoms. If you look at the neutral point, that's where Disney parks falls, and online gaming. So that's for people who play versus using a Xbox, using a PlayStation. So these are, you could really say, like, I mean, they're almost as neutral as you could get. And so you could almost say that they have positive views as well, although they technically are 1 and 2 points above the neutral point. Theme parks, which is our current study, that was overall the GBC was a 4.10, and that's the same as streaming. So both of those are 4.10s, and then you can see as you go over to the more negative side, sport has a mean of 4.49, and then the politics and electronic gaming, or online electronic gaming, so those people who use a platform versus those people who use the online platform or console, those reported much more negativity toward the out group than even to some extent sport fandom. I mean, because right now, as we zoom in, we're looking at the scale from a 3.5 to a 5. So if you zoom in that much, you could see there's actually a big difference between politics and electronic gaming than even sport. But then there's a big difference between sport and the rest of the things as well. And then obviously there's the gap between comics and science fiction. And so where does all this lead? Regarding the hierarchy of out-group derogation and the out-group derogation spectrum, it helps to teach about group behavior, which is something that over the last 6 or 7 years I've started to do more of. We have projects where we actually use comic books to try and teach school-age kids how to behave toward out-groups, and we use the sports setting to do that. We have a fictional character named Sport Rivalry Man who kind of goes and he tells these stories about, how people should treat each other, and should they help each other in emergency situations. If they are fans of different teams, how should they treat each other, with the overall goal that hopefully people glean from it that doesn't matter, or regardless of what t-shirt you are wearing, you're more alike than you're not. And then the broader goal of all of that would be, if you could teach this in the sports setting and teach that sport fandom doesn't cause this big a difference as well, maybe then we could do that in other settings as well, which takes me to my last point of looking for commonalities, which is something that we're actively doing right now. And that deals with the common in-group, people who tend to be members of multiple groups, tend to be more positive toward someone from an out group than an individual who may only be a fan of one group, or a member of have one fandom. Because that individual who only has one outlet of fandom, if that group is unsuccessful, they don't really have somewhere else to turn to. So that impacts their emotions, it impacts their psyche, and they tend to be more negative toward other people. Whereas if someone who is, let's say, a fan of a sport team and theme parks, and they can, if their sport team loses and they're upset, well, then they always have the option to escape, and if they're close enough, go to a theme park or watch theme park videos online, and maybe that makes them feel a little bit better, so they're not lashing out the way that other people would that only are fans of that one group. And then what the next thing we want to do, or down the line, is we want to start testing these common in groups. And so we're working through ways and trying to brainstorm ways to test these perceptions and behaviors, to see if being a fan of different groups, how does that impact not just the way you perceive the out group, but likely behaviors toward the out group. So would you be more likely to help someone in emergency situations if you are a member of one group or multiple groups, and try to find those types of comparisons and differences. And so I tried to be quick. I'll answer any questions if anybody has any. And again, thank you for letting me come into your session rather unannounced or on short notice.